Welcome to Leading Through Uncertainty. This webinar is for leaders or people who are working in organizations trying to influence change and build a culture of experimentation. Welcome, everyone. My name is David J. Bland. I'm an author and a founder out here in Northern California. Be taking care of you today. And let's just jump in because we have so much to cover, and I want to make sure that I get to everything before we wrap up this webinar. All right, so this is being recorded. I will put this up, and the team will put this up on YouTube. This is our YouTube channel. So if you cannot make this for whatever reason, or you have a friend who wanted to join but isn't available, then you can watch this on YouTube. Again, like and subscribe. The YouTube channel, we're uploading lots of content there. The podcast episodes are up there. So doing our best to grow the channel. So a little bit about myself. I'm David J. Bland. Again, I'm based out here in Northern California. My background was in startups before I started coaching and consulting around 2010 or so. And I've been really helping companies sort of reduce risk by using lean innovation. And I think we throw this term out, lean innovation, but I do want to give it a little bit of definition because sometimes I think we throw out terms and we just assume everyone knows what we're talking about. So with lean innovation, the way I define it anyway, is it's a combination of strengths from design thinking, agile, and lean startup. You could also fold in some other things there, because I use tools from, the business model canvas and things such as that. But for the most part, I'm looking at the strengths of design thinking, and you'll notice that in a lot of my work, from the desirable, viable, feasible framing from design thinking. We'll stuff from Agile, because I was exposed to Agile really early on in my career, and I'm a big believer in iterating through solutions. And then also Lean Startup, because I was early on in that movement as well, and I believe that you have to iterate through your problems, not just the solution. So I do think this combination of the three is very much needed to basically influence real change inside organizations. But I do think it provides sort of like a model for leading through uncertainty. So you have to be mindful of how you lead through uncertainty. And if you try to lead the same way that you lead through all the certain things, it's going to be quite traumatic, and there's going to be a lot of contradictions and confusion inside your company. I work with lots of different companies. These are just some of them. I really don't focus on a sector. I focus a lot on the early stage, extreme uncertainty type areas of growth that these companies are exploring. Some of them are trying to reimagine what they do in a different way. Others are trying to go into a new market. So this is where I focus a lot of my time and efforts. I still work with startups here and there too, and work with some investors in the Valley. But for most of the part, I'm going through these programs with large companies, and I'll share a little bit more about those when we wrap up. Also, a lot of what I'm going to pull from today is from Testing Business Ideas. So it's one of the best-selling business books in the world. I think we're close or at 100,000 copies sold. It's over 20 different languages. And I think why it landed so well was that we tested the book as we wrote it. Have some YouTube videos up on that as well. But basically, being able to have a guide to guide you through your testing process is really important. You can pick it up here. It's on Amazon. It's in, again, whatever your local bookseller site is, or brick and mortar, it's usually there. And I did include some leadership stuff in this book, but there's only so much you can fit in a book. And at some point, we had to go to print with the book. And in the back, there is some leadership recommendations and some of my thinking around leadership. To be fair, it could be its own book. I mean, the amount of stuff that you have to consider as a leader trying to create a culture of experimentation is enormous. And I think it can be overwhelming. And I want to touch on some of the ways I coach leaders through this process. But I don't know. Wiley keeps asking me to write another book. Maybe that'll be a topic. I don't know. But this idea of leading through this change, because what I found over the course of like the last 5 years or so, teams figure this out. There's plenty of tools and resources out there on the market today that weren't available 5, 10 years ago. And so this excuse of, well, we don't know what kind of experiment to run, so that's why we're not experimenting, doesn't really hold up as much anymore because there's plenty of other books like this out there in the market too. And so, and there are a bunch of different materials out there. And so I do think at some point in time, there may have been an excuse of, well, we don't know what kind of experiments to run, so we don't run experiments. I don't think that excuse holds up anymore. So then you have to start asking yourselves, okay, so if my teams aren't running experiments and we've given them copies of the book or other books that have experiments in them, we've given them training and they're still not running experiments, like what is it holding them back? And reality is you have to go deeper than the surface level of, okay, well, maybe they just don't have enough experiments and that's what's going on. You have to get below that and kind of dig a bit deeper. So when I'm working with leadership, and leadership is a really key component to change inside your organization and how you lead through uncertainty, what I'm noticing is it's not just an execution problem, it's a language problem. And so when it comes to the words we use as leaders and helping teams sort of understand the why behind we're experimenting, I think we focus a bit too much on the how. And I was definitely guilty of that early in my consulting and coaching career. You know, I would come into organizations, you know, I remember some of the first organizations I coached in San Francisco, and I was all about the how. You know, here's how you design your experiments, and here's how you map your assumptions and all that. But from a leadership point of view, you really do need to have a language that supports that way of working and create, you know, this context of the why behind it. And sometimes it may sound a little repetitive in the sense of, oh, I'm just asking the same questions over and over again, or I'm espousing these things over and over again. I must sound like a broken record. That's not necessarily the case. It does take some repetition to get to this point where you're building a culture of experimentation. I talked to this leader in Silicon Valley once, and he said, you know, this is in our bloodstream, but it's not in our DNA. And I think what he meant by that was, yes, we have some people running experiments and navigating uncertainty, but it's not really part of the core of how we work yet. If we stop talking about it, people are going to revert back. And sure enough, I won't name the company, but they did stop talking about it because they thought this is something that's in our DNA now. We're fine. We don't have to, as leaders, keep talking about all this stuff that we're doing. And sure enough, people reverted back. So there is an element of sort of momentum here and repetition that helps you kind of create this culture. So what I want to do is I want to create just a quick poll. And if you all could just participate in this, this would be amazing. So the poll is, when's the last time, you know, or how often do your leaders say, I don't know, in your organization? So when you talk about this phrase, you know, I don't know, this is a very interesting phrase inside organizations because it's not necessarily indicative of all of your culture. But if you have leaders who don't ever say this, then it could be a telltale sign of your org and where you are in the maturity level of being able to create a culture of experimentation and being able to navigate uncertainty, because you almost have to own up to the fact that you may not have the answers here to help move forward. So I'm going to keep this poll open for 5 more seconds. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so here's what we're seeing so far from everyone is we have a mix. We have some folks that say they never hear it. We have some folks that are saying, well, we rarely hear it. Some of you sometimes. We have a couple here that say it's often and regularly. But I do think that needs to be more of the norm if we're trying to be really mindful of our language and how we, as leaders, lead through uncertainty and basically inspire others to work this way. So I'm going to kind of walk through some stuff with you today. First is, I love this quote from Peter Drucker. It's, the bottleneck is always at the top of the bottle. And so as leaders, we need to be able to thinking about, okay, we are often the bottleneck. And if we're the bottleneck for all the decision making inside the company, it's going to be really hard to scale leadership across your company and be able to navigate a lot of uncertainty in your company, especially for the new stuff where you're trying to go into a new market, or you're trying to reimagine what you do in a different way. This can be really challenging if we're the bottleneck. So how do we maybe like stop becoming the bottleneck? Now, there's different ways to frame leadership, and there are a bunch of leadership books, and I'm not necessarily going to dive into all these different leadership books today. But the way I try to categorize this is there is a style. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad style. I'm really going to try to do my best not to say this is like bad or good, in a way. But there's definitely a transactional leadership style. And it's very surface level trust. So, I kind of talk in first person a lot. And so when you think about your leaders inside your company, do you hear them say a lot of like me, myself, I? There's not so much of third person usage. There's a lot of first person usage. That can be a sign a bit that they're using a transactional leadership style. And I've noticed when we talk about accountability in companies, it's almost always with a negative connotation. It's almost always as if I'm holding you accountable. And there are almost like implied consequences if you don't do what you said you were going to do. And that's what I mean by the transaction. It's between the leader, sort of, if you think about it of the transaction point of view, it's like I'm telling you to do a thing, and then you're doing the thing. And if you do the thing, then we have trust. Okay. But if you think about that level of trust, that's a very surface level of trust. When you ask somebody to do a thing and they do the thing, and you're holding them accountable to do the thing. So it could be, we have to launch on this date. We have to get this feature out by this date, or we have to stay on budget. We have to stay on scope. A lot of that old school kind of triangle stuff. It's a lot of based in transactional leadership of I'm holding you accountable to do this thing. Now there are different types of accountability that I will go into later today in this webinar. But when you think about it, it's very much almost always in a negative connotation, at least when I come into orgs. When people say we have accountability problem, usually this is what they're talking about. They're talking about, well, I told you to do a thing and you didn't do the thing, so we have an accountability problem. So it's a style, right? It's a transaction style. Also, what I've noticed in transactional, and again, we're still focused on transactional here, is that the leader leads with answers quite a bit. So it's almost like I'm the expert, I'm the leader, I know best. I'm going to hold you accountable to doing a thing that I tell you to do. And I'm basically going to tell you, if you have any questions, I'm going to tell you the answers, right? I'm always going to have the answer. Now, what tends to happen here is you become a leader inside an organization and behave this way because you were really good at a thing inside the organization. So maybe you were the best at a certain type of job, and then people started coming to you for questions about that type of job, and you would give them answers because you had the expertise. And then you get promoted because you're really good at a thing. But unfortunately, what happens there sometimes is there isn't necessarily accompanying leadership training or a way to lead in a way that's not in that style. So it happens more often than not inside organizations that I go into, is that you were sort of an individual contributor that was an expert, and then you're promoted because you know a certain thing, but then they really didn't give you the skills you needed or the training to apply that in a way where you can build leaders around you, or you can work with people underneath of you. So what happens is you have this kind of IC mindset, and you're still treating everything like a transaction. And this isn't just at the director level, this goes all the way up to the C-suite. And so if you've been promoted completely all the way up to the C-suite based on this leadership style, then you're going to say, this is what works for me and this is what I'm going to use. But I don't even know if leaders are aware that this is what they're doing. And I think we lack the feedback loops inside organizations to basically walk through this. Okay, you're almost always talking in first person. You're usually holding people accountable, and you're leading with answers. This may work in certain scenarios. Again, if it's a known problem and known solution, not much changes, you can say, I've done this before, I know the answer. But anytime you get into uncertainty, especially with trying to create something new, like a new revenue driver, new area of growth, going into a new market, your expertise may work against you in this manner. And so when you try to apply this leadership style, it can backfire. And I think that's what we see from orgs where we're trying to build a culture of experimentation, but the leaders themselves are not necessarily aware or have the feedback of their leadership styles and how that might need to change to help navigate all this uncertainty. So one of the things I ask when I'm coming in is like, do you hear the language that sort of promotes a culture of experimentation? Because anytime with uncertainty, you can't really treat it as a known thing. You have to kind of probe and sense and respond. So you need to go run a test, see what happens, see how everything responds to that, and see, okay, we're trying to make this more knowable of what we're trying to do. So some of the things you might hear from a transactional leadership point of view is you're hearing things like, well, I think you should, again, it's, I think, if it were me, I would, right? As for myself, I want. So again, there's a lot of this first person language you're going to hear inside your org. And it can contradict things because if you're saying, we're going to build a culture of experimentation, and then all of your language is still about what you know as a leader, then people are going to hesitate to experiment. They are going to look for you to the answers because that's what you do. You provide all the answers. So you have to begin to question, well, if I'm a team member and my leader is always providing me the answers, then why am I experimenting? And I've seen this play out in real world scenarios when I go in and coach. So I'm not going to name the company, but early on in my career, I went into one of the most well-known companies in Silicon Valley. And what I do is I run programs. So I'm running these 10-week, 12-week programs. And basically what we do is we kind of frame up your risk, we prioritize it, and we go test. So I use this method called EMT, extract, map, test. I have a lot about that. And it's actually based on the Testing Business Ideas book, but I've opened it up since the book released. So we go through this process on real opportunities. And I remember vividly going into what we call these pivot, persevere, kill decision meetings with this time was a VP of product. And we said, here are the risks that we outlined. Here are the experiments we ran. Here's the evidence we generated. Here are the insights we have. And we actually recommend that we don't take this idea forward. Especially with this company, it was a very B2B company, and the evidence we were getting back is this was a B2C, and nobody wanted to pivot to B2C inside this company. So we were making this recommendation as a team. The VP said, okay, but I still think this is a good idea. I still think this is a good idea. What do you think that did to the team's morale or the team's willingness to experiment? Yeah, it completely crushed it. And it was just one sentence that I'm not even sure the VP had thought through before he spoke. And so if you're trying to create a culture of experimentation and people do this and they say, okay, this is the way we're going to work now. It's a new way of working. We're going to provide our information. We're going to provide a recommendation. And then we're either going to take this idea forward and invest more because there's a signal there. We're either going to pivot to a different segment, or we are going to kill this idea because there's nothing there. And they do all this, and then your leader is like, yeah, but I still think this is a good idea. It just killed all the momentum that we spent 10 weeks working on creating, because the team came back out of that meeting and said, well, why did we waste our time experimenting? If they're going to explain away everything that doesn't meet their worldview, why are we doing this? Why don't we just build what we're told to build? So again, when you apply this sort of transactional level of leadership language and style, when you're trying to build a culture of experimentation, then even maybe without knowing, you're undermining what you're trying to build, because it's quite a different leadership style to go through these early stage, high uncertainty, extreme uncertainty projects. So the way I'm framing this is, well, it's more of a transformational leadership style that we need to adopt as leaders to empower our teams and create a culture of experimentation inside companies. So again, I'm not saying one's good or bad. With transformational, though, you are sort of tasked with creating more leaders around you. And that's intentional. because again, the bottleneck's always at the top of the bottle. So if you're ever going to scale your company and scale decision making and critical thinking skills, then you need to do things like talk in third person more. Yeah. So we, our, us, not necessarily first person. I, me, myself. We also have to really reevaluate our accountability model inside the org, because no longer is it a transaction where I'm saying, go do this thing, and then you show me how you did the thing. Instead of holding accountable, we're more about giving an account. And it may sound silly, but it's nuanced, but it does make a big difference. So if you are coming into this decision meeting where we're saying we're going to pivot, persevere, and kill, and you're coming in with a mindset of, okay, as a group, we need to make this decision, and I'm not holding them accountable to running experiments, I'm giving them a framework and space to give an account of whether or not we should take this idea forward or not. And so it's a subtle little sort of accountability shift where we're giving the team the ability to give their recommendation, to give an account of how they're de-risking this business or product. And they're doing it by running experiments and showing what their insights are and what their recommendations are. So you're giving them the space to do the critical thinking. I think this might be where we lost our way with Agile a bit, is that I think what happened with Agile is we have an iterative process for delivery, but it's almost as if all the other things were figured out before then. And so we're saying, okay, now go iterate, but all the decisions have kind of been made. And so your space in which you can apply your critical thinking skills is almost confined to the building. Yeah, we're not going to build it all at once in big batches. We're going to build it sort of iteratively. But I think we kind of went astray somewhere. And I have some theories of why we went astray. Maybe that'll be a different webinar. But I think some of the frameworks and things that we've tried, or maybe philosophies you could say, have tried to apply to orgs that help deal with uncertainty, we've sort of constrained them in a way where we can't necessarily use them to their full potential anymore. We're playing in this really tiny box of where we're allowed to iterate, not necessarily questioning the why we're building. Also, what I've noticed from a transformational style is that we're leading more with questions. And it doesn't mean you always lead with questions. Obviously, if you have some expertise, you can weigh in, of course. But the idea of leading with questions is very powerful in when you're trying to create leaders around you and you're trying to create the critical thinking skills and nurture those and say that and show that they are appreciated. And so quite often, when I'm pulled into an organization, I'm asked, hey, can you help us create a common language? So what tends to happen is we all use these different words and we're talking past one another. So can we have some kind of common language to navigate this? Also, what tends to happen is we're saying, along with a common language, can you help us create these like critical thinking skills and kind of push them down to our teams? So I'm a big believer that a large portion of your revenue should come from the teams that are closest to the customers. Those opportunities, you're not going to find, as a leader managing the entire org, those opportunities are going to be found by the teams closest to the customers. They're going to find these unmet needs, and they need the critical thinking skills, and they need to be empowered in a way where they can surface these opportunities and say, this is something we can explore to generate more revenue in the company. And so in order to do that, it's really tough to do that using a transactional style leadership, of leadership, in the sense of you have to be able to promote these critical thinking skills in a way where they can find these and offer them up, and then they can give an account of how they're de-risking these opportunities with you. So it's a subtle kind of shift. Now, when you think about the language you're going to hear from someone that's using more transformational leadership style, you're going to hear things like, well, what do you think we should? So, it's almost like, what do you think is the riskiest assumption in this idea? And ask the teams to apply the critical thinking skills and offer that up for you versus you telling them what the riskiest assumption is. It'd be good to know, do they think it's desirability, viability, feasibility? Which one? Is it a combination thereof? Making sure that you're understanding and communicating the goal really well of why we're doing this. Who could help us, in a way beyond just the teams. Maybe the teams can't figure this out. They need help from leaders. I've done this a lot in the past where, we'll come to the corporate officers and we'll ask for help because we're trying to get access to customers, but maybe there's a process that's preventing us from getting access to customers. So how could we get access? Like, how can you help us? So the language we're using here is not necessarily first person directive. It's more about third person, and you're trying to create leaders, around you. So people always ask me for examples. This is one of my favorite examples. So I do a lot of work with DuPont. Alexa Dimbeck is amazing. She's the Chief Technology and Sustainability Officer at DuPont. And she does this thing called Dead Projects Day. And I participated in a few of these. You can see her dressed up over here. They all dress up in costume because they do this on Halloween. So it's a kind of a fun celebration inside the company where they are giving space to celebrating killing off ideas. And there's a LinkedIn sort of post down here if you want to read more about their public, write-up of this. And I find it very refreshing that a company that large and that profitable and based and steeped in scientific method will give space to say, well, these ideas didn't work. Let's celebrate that, and kind of in a goofy type, kind of fun way. And let's talk about why they didn't work. And more, what I'm seeing across my clients is that these things aren't failing because your company is unable to build the thing that you want to build. You all can build anything. That is no longer the constraint, unless it's like time travel. You can build pretty much anything. And what is happening across these companies is we're seeing things get killed because the unmet needs are not urgent and severe. They're more like headache problems versus migraine problems. And the customers might just ignore it and give away. It'll go away. There's a very lukewarm approach to the feedback they give you on when you start digging into the problem. Also, what I've noticed is from a viability point of view, they simply aren't profitable enough or meaningful enough for the company to continue to invest and bring it forward. And sometimes I call these zombie projects where they're kind of not living and they're not dead and they kind of suck morale and people don't know what the goal is anymore and they keep working on them because no one's putting criteria to actually kill them off. And I gave a keynote not too long ago and I kind of asked all these leaders inside many different industries, why do you think things fail? And had them raise their hand. And surprisingly, the entire room almost held up their hand when I asked about viability, because quite often what happens, they can build anything and there's a need there, but the customers won't pay enough for it, or it's too expensive to actually create and keep going. So yes, they could solve that problem, but there's no way they can keep it going without losing money. So I do think when you talk about how to do this inside companies, something as simple as this, where you can just celebrate why you're killing off ideas and socializing it inside the company, is needed. Think of it almost as like marketing, but it's marketing inside your company. You're marketing the idea of this, building a culture of experimentation and being able to socialize that this is something that we want to support inside the company. And so it can be as simple as little things like this, where you celebrate the things that failed and people realize, hey, I'm not going to get fired if my idea didn't fail because there was no product market fit, which sounds insane to say out loud, but it still happens inside companies where you almost get this it's like a career limiting move because you worked on something that failed. But basically, you don't want to invest in something that was going to fail anyway. So we need to kind of change the way we lead through that and socialize it and make it clear to people that this is where we're headed as a company. So if you're looking at some more practical things, maybe you don't want to do a Dead Projects Day quite yet, and you want to start thinking through, well, what could I say? So instead of saying something, can I try something else? So it's almost like this lean, like I call it like lean leadership, like this shift of going from left to right. So instead of saying something like, well, are we building this the right way? Because that's a very feasibility focused thing. What you could try instead as a leader is like, are we working on the right project? Are we working on the right thing? So it's kind of like the shift from can we build it to should we build it? And it's amazing to me how often this is just skipped over because we're so good at building things that we focus a lot of our questions and as leaders is on the building of it. But we don't question enough of should we be building this at all? Should we be building this at all? Also, something you can think of is saying, instead of saying, did we meet all the requirements? Asking things around, well, do we even have any evidence that if we met these requirements, the customer will pay enough? What are the switching costs for the customer? Sometimes you can meet all the requirements and they still don't pay enough, or they don't pay at all, and then you became a really expensive R&D lab for another customer. ROI is a really tricky one because a lot of leaders are used to asking about ROI questions, but especially with this high uncertainty work, you may not see ROI right away. So when we think this near-term quarterly thinking of ROI, we have to kind of change our questions a bit to more around what are the leading indicators that this will generate revenue for us? Are we kind of closing the say-do gap? And do we have any indication that this will generate revenue? But not necessarily just asking ROI questions, especially with early stage innovation. Another one you might think of is instead of just focusing on feasibility, what are our risks around desirability and viability? The customer unmet needs, the jobs to be done, willingness to pay, our cost structure. Quite often feasibility is not the biggest risk. At least that's what I'm seeing across my client list. Very rarely am I doing any kind of feasibility coaching anymore. It's almost all desirability and viability because that's where the biggest risks lie, especially when they're creating new things. Coming back to transactional leadership style, are we going to deliver on time and on budget? More of a, well, how can we help you make progress? Like, how can we help you de-risk this? Not necessarily a transactional style of you need to release this thing by this date. How are we helping you de-risk? And then finally, the I still think it's a good idea. Asking more about what do you think the biggest risk is moving forward? And that desirable, viable, feasible framing helps really well there. Where you say, well, I think the biggest risk is desirability. Oh, tell me more. What is it about desirability? Or I think the biggest risk is viability. I don't know if the customer will pay enough. They say they will, but there's no skin in the game yet. So how do we close that gap? So these are just some examples that you can practice. And it does take time. It's not like you flip the switch and then all of a sudden you're a transformational leader. But you can make intentional shifts over time of trying to move from a transactional leadership style that's focused heavily on feasibility to more of a transformational style where we're asking questions, trying to get at the risk and how are we going to pay down this risk, especially on these high uncertainty new ideas. So when you think of this from a larger perspective, let's say you have a goal and it's to drive new growth inside the company. This was one of the reasons I'm brought in quite a bit is because the company wants to drive new growth, but their existing processes have not yielded that yet. And there's usually gaps in those processes, and I come in and do a bit of diagnostic work to understand where the gaps are. But there's a lot of uncertainty because this is something, it's like almost like the hardest work they do inside the organization. There's some known stuff that if they do this certain thing, they can predict the ROI. And this stuff, it's early stage. It could be a huge opportunity. It could be almost nothing. We're trying to figure that out. And the only really way to figure it out is to do the work and do the discovery. And then you find out, you kind of reduce the ambiguity in the size of the opportunity. So what happens typically is we focus on the teams, and it's almost like we focus too much on the teams. So we look at the teams, we're like, okay, that they need access to customers. We have to have cross-functional teams. We need to be running experiments. We need to get right tooling. And a lot of the support doesn't go beyond the teams. And I think this is where some of the transactional leadership style works against building a culture of experimentation, because it's almost like, well, I'm just going to give all this direct support to the teams and then we'll be okay. But what tends to happen here is that you need more support around the teams than we have at just a direct support level. So I call this sort of like the systemic support. And it's not necessarily everything you need to keep going, but they at least need this. It's more like necessary and sufficient, right? This is necessary but not sufficient, but it's definitely beyond the teams when it comes to systemic support. So this is where we start to talk to things about like processes, like what are our overall processes for this? Do we have a pipeline of ideas? Do we have some metrics we're going to measure? Do we have coaches? I spend a lot of my time training coaches inside organizations now and building out entire training capabilities inside my companies because I don't clone very well. As much as I would love to, I can't clone myself. And the coaches themselves, there are people in your org who will make amazing coaches. They just don't have the space or the structure to do it. And so we have community and practice and everything. And we have curriculum for coaches. So this is something you're going to need beyond a team level. Also creating playbooks. So for example, you take the Testing Business Ideas book. It's great. It has 44 different experiments. They probably all don't apply to you. And so what is that subset of experiments that work for you? How would you know? How would you start beginning that list? Are there other experiments not listed in the book that could be part of your playbook? They need time. You're not going to be able to drive new growth inside your company in your spare time. Like this is incredibly hard to do. And so how as a leader are you going to support the teams to give them space to drive new growth? And then this idea of a portfolio of, looking at your pillars and, what is the portfolio of what we're going to attack and what are the themes and everything. So it's beyond the teams. And again, I love working with teams, but I don't think the teams are the constraint anymore. And I don't think we have enough organizations understanding that we need systemic support around the teams for this change to occur and for us to have meaningful revenue growth. It's not just hit or miss. You can't do this by doing a project or two. You need a repeatable process for testing. So at a leadership level, where you can also provide a lot of value, is at the strategic support level. And so I won't cover everything here, but some key points to think of. Like, what are the incentives to working this way? If we're asking them to work a different way, what is the incentive structure for that? Do we have sponsorship? When we come to these pivot, persevere, kill decisions, do we have sponsors in that meeting that can help pull something forward? And just a funding point of view, not just give it lip service, but also bring this forward in a way with real money attached to it, And so coming back to funding. Do you have a narrative? Like, do you have an idea of what you're trying to test? Are you giving the right signals in how you communicate? So there are all these different aspects of strategic support that need to occur as well. And so I think what happens sometimes is we're way too focused here and we're ignoring some of the systemic support that is needed to build a culture of experimentation and helping people navigate uncertainty. And we're missing some of the strategic support. And that's where, as leaders, you can really help put some of that in place as well. Now, what tends to happen here is this is way too much to do all at once. Some of you are probably looking at this and your eyes are kind of like glossing over. And you're like, oh my gosh, I can't even begin to think where to start with this. It's okay to start with the teams, but my challenge to you is how do I go beyond the teams? So let's just say, an example of one of my engagements. We might start with the teams and some experiments and access to customers, but we're also quickly trying to build up coaching inside the company simultaneously. So if we're doing workshops, we're inviting people who are potential coaches to those workshops, and they're leveling up through the process as well. And you're kind of organically growing your coaches. We're building a process for more ideas for the pipeline. If you only have 2 or 3 ideas, then what's going to happen, unfortunately, is you're going to have teams that latch onto those ideas and they won't let them go because they're afraid there are no other ideas to work on. And so if they kill this idea, where do they go? And they're nervous about that. And so I've seen this behavior in teams where at first I was like, why aren't we just killing this idea? There's nothing there. And then I realized, oh, we don't actually have any other ideas in the pipeline. So this team doesn't want to let go of this idea. This kind of stuff plays out, different ways. Funding, tying it to funding. Even if it's just, a really basic metered funding, let's take, a few ideas through this and start training up our coaches and tie it to funding. So you don't have to worry about all this at once. It's too overwhelming. Think of it as, what's kind of our map? What's our strategy? How are we going to start picking off pieces of this, and as leaders start supporting this, so it's not just a workshop. It's not just, oh, we had something and now everyone goes back to working the way they did. That is not going to help you inflict, change inside your organization. So what I'm offering with all of you today in the webinar, so go ahead and take out your phones and take a picture of this, is if you're stuck or you're looking at that and you're feeling overwhelmed and you want to bring your innovation challenge to me, I will spend 30 minutes hanging out with you and diagnosing what you are telling me. And, I can pull from my vast expertise across all these other different companies that I've worked with over time, over the last 15 years. And we could start trying to find a path forward for you. Okay? So I just wanted to give you that opportunity today, and thanks for hanging out with me. So if you can't find a time on that, you can also look at the email at the bottom left there. We have contact@precoil.com. No time slots work for you. You can just find an email and email us, and we will find a spot for you. I want to thank you all hanging out with me today. We talked about a lot of different leadership styles, the difference between transactional and transformational, some of the things that I've seen that help provide stickiness to your change inside your organizations. And I just want to thank you all for hanging out. Keep working at it. You'll find your way through this. Thanks.